Welcome to Biology 308. This is Karen Drake, and we're starting with Chapter 18, which has to do with the blood. So here's an electron micrograph picture. They come out black and white, but you can take computer colors like Photoshop and make the different things different colors. So they've made the red blood cells red to show you those. And you can always tell them because they have a dip in the middle. So this is actually like a little valley inside there. And if you flip it over, there's a valley in the other side. And here are your white blood cells. And they tend to have little projections coming out. They're feeling for foreign invaders, things that should not be in your body. Or they're feeling for cells that are diseased, like cancer cells, so they can attack them. These, you don't usually have so many of these in an area, but these are your platelets. You need these things to cause blood to clot. So what they've done here is they've started a clot, and then they stopped it and took a picture of it. So you can see that you're starting to get a clotting protein called fibrin. Here's some of that. You can see these streamers right there, and they're kind of going to attach the red blood cells and the platelets, and the white blood cells are going to get trapped in there too. So anything that's solid will get trapped into the clot. So if you took a scab off once you've cut yourself or whatever and looked at it closely, this is the sort of thing that you'd see. Now, this is not what your regular blood looks like under the microscope because it should not be clotting, and you should not have this many platelets. Your book points out that there's a difference between the circulatory system and the cardiovascular system. Circulatory system is the blood, the heart, and the blood vessels. And the cardiovascular, vascular means blood vessels, so that's just the heart and the blood vessels. And then if you study just the blood itself, that's hematology. So this chapter that we're studying is hematology. And there's so much to know about blood that we'll probably spend a couple of hours talking about it. So you know that blood has liquid in it, and you know that it has the red blood cells. Hopefully you know about white blood cells, and you're going to learn more, much more in this chapter. So some of the things that blood does is it transports things. It carries things around your body. So you know that it carries oxygen from the lungs, and it takes it throughout the body and drops it off, and it picks up carbon dioxide, brings it to the lungs, and you exhale the excess carbon dioxide to get rid of it. You know that when you eat, you digest, and the things get down in your intestines and absorbed into your body, and you have your blood system that picks up all those nutrients and spreads those throughout the body. So once it's gone out, dropped off good stuff, it can pick up waste. It can break down bits and pieces of cells that are being recycled, part of that Snickers bar or that steak you just ate, or red beans and rice if you're a vegan, and he'll take that to the to the kidneys. And then we're going to learn about hormones, which the endocrine system is kind of weird in that it just sprays the hormone out, and it trusts that the circulatory system will pick it up, carry it to whatever organ needs that particular hormone. So we have a chapter that will talk about the endocrine system and the different hormones and what they do. And one of the things that this version or this new edition of the Saladin textbook talks about is stem cells. So this is exciting. Stem cells are cells that haven't decided what they want to be when they grow up. So they can become what they need to be. And as we get older, we have fewer stem cells, but we still make them in our bone marrow. So this is a good thing. So you can provide bone marrow to somebody who needs a marrow transplant. So we'll be talking about that. So transport, because it's fluid, because it's running throughout the entire body, you can transport all sorts of things to and from different organs. We also have protection. This is, you have complement, and you have cytokines, you have white blood cells, and antibodies. So we have been talking quite a bit about that sort of thing in the news lately because of COVID, and they're talking about, will we get enough antibodies? If you get a vaccination, will you have enough antibodies in your bloodstream to keep you from getting COVID or to keep you from spreading COVID? So this is going to be hopefully important in your life for you to understand this. And of course, platelets keep us from bleeding to death. So most of us, if you cut your finger, within a minute or so, you've got a scab and it stops bleeding. If you damage yourself inside, internal bleeding, you can bleed to death. So this is one of the reasons a lot of people are rushed to the hospital and they take their spleen out to keep them from bleeding to death. And that always made me curious. Why would you go and say, oh my goodness, here they are in the hospital, let's take their spleen out? Well, because the spleen has such a large artery and it is so easy to bleed out, that's one organ that they can take out and clamp off that artery so you don't bleed out from that area. So I was always curious. I thought that is so odd. And unfortunately, it happens to be in an area where if you're going to get hit in the abdomen, you get hit by the steering wheel, you get hit in a sports game, that you can rupture the spleen. So anyway, I was curious. So now maybe I solved that for you. Another thing that the circulatory system does is it regulates your body. So you have hopefully over and over and over heard the word homeostasis. Homeo means same, stasis means not changing. So you need your body to be in a state of homeostasis in order for it to function correctly. And we'll talk about that in just a second, different things that have to be a certain way. So the pH of your stomach needs to be a certain pH of your blood needs to be a certain range, and you can't live if you're not in that range. We know that if your temperature, for example, your body temperature, if you get too cold, then you die of hypothermia. You don't have enough heat to keep your body going. And we know that if your temperature rises over 105, you'll probably start having seizures. And if it gets any higher than that, it can cause so much brain damage that you die. So we have just a narrow range of temperatures that we can work in, a narrow range of pHs, a certain amount of sodium and potassium, and all the other ions. So the blood is very good at keeping or maintaining a homeostasis. So it buffers acids. So you don't really think about it when you drink a Coke, but you're drinking carbonic acid, which tastes wonderful, but you just acidified your body. So you need to cancel or buffer or neutralize that acid so that it doesn't hurt you. And when you eat pretzels, look at all the salt that's on the outside of the pretzels. That's way too much salt for you to have in your body. That's going to upset the equilibrium. But we sit and eat pretzels and potato chips and salty foods, and most of us don't have any problem with it whatsoever. We just pee out the extra salt. But we need the blood to get that and move it, get rid of it. So we'll talk about how the blood regulates. And one of the things, we're warm-blooded. So we're constantly making energy, using energy, and wasting energy. A great percentage of the food that you eat is wasted as heat energy. But it makes it nice because when it gets cold outside, we don't stop moving like snakes and things. So that's a kind of a nice thing for us. Because we generate our own heat, we can keep going and we can eat and we can hunt day and night, hot and cold. So you get too hot, you start sweating. You get too cold, you start shivering. The first picture that I showed you was an actual picture of real human blood and platelets and white blood cells. Now, this picture is a cartoon showing you the various shapes and colors and sizes of the blood components. So we call these formed elements because they actually have a shape. Then you have the liquid part of the blood, which we call plasma. So you're going to have large cells that aren't shown in this particular picture called megakaryocytes, and they fragment. Pieces of them just come apart, and those go out into your bloodstream as platelets. So these little things are your platelets, and they're much smaller than the red blood cells. And here are red blood cells. They're obvious because they are biconcave. They have a cave shape, a curve, a dimple on both sides, biconcave. And what happened was, when they were made in the beginning, they looked like a regular cell. But as they filled up with hemoglobin and filled up with hemoglobin, which is the red pigment that makes them red, which is what carries oxygen, they eventually threw out their nucleus. They literally ejected their nucleus. And so now they are dented in where the nucleus used to be. So this is kind of nice because it increases the surface area and it makes them thinner, so it's easier for oxygen to come in and carbon dioxide to swap out. So that's a nice thing. But the problem with throwing away your nucleus is you just killed yourself. So red blood cells don't last that long. And so we're constantly building new ones, making new ones, and tearing down and recycling the parts of the old dead ones that don't function anymore. And then we have 5 major classes of white blood cells. So we have these really large ones called monocytes, and the monocytes crawl around and eat things that shouldn't be there, and they're really, really large. And then we have lymphocytes, which look a lot like it, but are much smaller. So there's your lymphocytes and your monocytes in comparison. Now, a long time ago, when they were looking at people who had what we call mononucleosis, they saw really large lymphocytes and they misnamed them. They said, oh, those are so big that they can't be lymphocytes, so they must be monocytes. So actually, mononucleosis is not large monocytes, it's large lymphocytes. But we've already named it mono, and you guys probably call it the kissing disease. You spread it by kissing somebody and then they get it. And it's characterized by being just completely wiped out. I had a student who had it, and she slept pretty much for a month. She was completely wiped out. So I'll never forget that. And I didn't ask her who she kissed to get it. You have 3 types of granulocytes. So the lymphocytes and the monocytes don't look like they have granules in them. But these definitely look like they have granules in them. So the basophil is, those little bags are mostly full of histamine. So basophils will release histamine, and you guys know that if you have histamine, then you have runny nose, you may have diarrhea. So it causes fluid problems. And so to keep these things from degranulating and releasing the histamine, you take an antihistamine like Benadryl or something of that nature. The let's see if I can find one. Eosinophil. There you go. I knew there had to be one. All right, eosinophils are kind of cool. It looks like a telephone receiver. And of course, you guys, the oldest phone you've ever seen probably is a flip phone. But a long time ago, they used to have telephones. And you put one into your mouth and one into your ear, and they kind of look like that. And then when you stain these, the little granules in there turn red. And usually you don't have very many of these in your bloodstream, but if you do, quite often it means you have a worm infection. So you've got worms inside you. So I always think that that's fun. The basophils are usually elevated if you're having an allergic reaction to something. If you're having hay fever or you're allergic to cats or something like I am. And then the third kind of granulocyte is called a neutrophil. It's actually called a polymorphonuclear leukocyte, or PMN for short. But neutrophil is not nearly as big a mouthful. Polymorpho, poly means many, morpho means shapes. So look at this. This is the nucleus. Look how many blobs and weird shapes it has. And look at this one. So it has a really odd nucleus. So a multi-shaped, a polymorphonuclear shape. And then all your white blood cells are called leukocytes. If you look, since you have the textbook that has that's online, you have places where it'll ask you questions. So in that picture we were just looking at, you can guess which one is which and name it. And that one right there, I know that one happens to be a PMN or a neutrophil right there. So you can check and see if your answers are correct. And I urge you to do that as you're reading the book. And here's a nice little table that tells you just what I just said. Another name for red blood cells is erythrocytes. And another name for white blood cells is leukocyte. Leuko means white cells. And then we talked about the three kinds of granulocytes and the two that do not have granules in them that are sometimes confused because the nucleus looks a lot alike in those. I'm sure all of you have had your blood drawn and they put it in a tube and you don't really think about it, but there's different tubes. They have different colored tops right there, and that tells the person, the phlebotomist who's drawing your blood, what's going to happen to the blood once it enters the tube. So there's a slight vacuum in the tube so that once they stick the needle in through your vein, it's going to suck the blood out and fill up this tube. And some of them don't have anything in them but air. And if that's the way it is, then the blood is going to clot and you're going to get a big gooey clot down the bottom of the tube. And that removes all of the fibrin, it removes the platelets and things like that. And you're just left with some of the hormones, some of the electrolytes. So sometimes that's all you want to see when you're studying the blood. So they'll use a tube like that. And then we have other tubes that have EDTA in them or other things that will keep the blood from clotting. And so if you want to look at the red blood cells, if you want to look at the white blood cells, then you can't have it clot because otherwise it's just a big gooey, gummy mess. And once they've drawn your blood for whatever kind of tube that they use, and they're called vacuolators because they have a vacuum in them that sucks the blood out of you, then they put it in a centrifuge and they spin it. And a centrifuge just applies a gravity to pull the formed elements down to the bottom. So you should have about 45% of red blood cells. Now this is going to vary. If you are a guy, you're going to have more red blood cells than a woman has. And women, if you happen to be having your period, if you happen to be anemic, then your red blood cell amount is going to be less. But that's one of the things they look at. What percentage of your blood is plasma and what percentage of your blood is red blood cells. And then in between the two, you have what we call a Buffy Coat. So there's your Buffy Coat, and that's where your white blood cells are. So they're above the red blood cells and below the plasma, right there. And you can tell right away if you draw blood from somebody and spin it down and you look and see a big Buffy Coat, you don't even have to run any tests. You go, uh-oh, that person has an infection going on. So I can see that just by looking at the Buffy Coat. So it should be almost negligent right there. So the spun down blood is called hematocrit. Hemato means blood, and so hematocrit is sometimes they don't draw a whole tube out. They'll just get it looks like a tiny, tiny glass straw, and they used to do that with a finger prick. But nowadays they just seem to want to go ahead and do venipuncture and just get a whole tube, and they can look for all kinds of things. Now, this is what I call a lookup table, and you do not have to memorize all of the stuff on this table, because whenever you have your blood drawn, they should give you your results back, and they should say, this is what your hematocrit was, this is what percent red blood cells you had to plasma. It should tell you how much hemoglobin that you have per deciliter. It should give you your mean red blood cell count. So for each little bit of blood that they analyze through their machines, how many red blood cells are there? How many platelets are there? How thick is your blood? So if you've ever cut yourself and then you get a clot and then you notice that there's kind of an oozing sticky stuff that comes out, and that's some plasma. Actually, if it's clotted, it's called serum. Plasma is not clotted, and serum is clotted. So it's the same stuff, but the serum has had the clotting stuff removed from it. So a woman has between 4 to 5 liters of blood. A guy has 5 to 6 liters. And that's partly because males are bigger. They generally tend to be larger than females are. But obviously, that's not always true. And the volume per your body weight should be, for every kilogram that you weigh, then you should have 80 to 85 milliliters of blood. So Americans are not used to talking about kilograms and milliliters. We're used to talking about, oh, I weigh 100 pounds. So you would have to convert how many pounds you are to kilograms in order to make any sense of this particular table. And most people think that their body temperature is 98.6 because we're used to taking an external temperature. We're used to either putting the little thing on the forehead and getting the reading there, or putting a thermometer under your tongue. We used to take a rectal temperature, and it was more accurate as to what your real body temperature was because it's actually inside your body. So it would be about 99 to 100 degrees if you take your temperature rectally. And then, of course, we have the little thing that shoots into the ear and looks at the temperature through the eardrum. So we have various ways of taking it, but your body, inside your body, your temperature is around 100. So, but we don't, you'd have to actually cut somebody open or stick a thermometer through their skin. But when you draw the blood out, you can get the temperature right then. So viscosity has to do with the stickiness. How sticky? Does it feel like syrup? Does it feel like egg white? Or does it feel like water? That's the viscosity. And osmolarity, we're going to talk about osmosis. And you should have already done that in the first half of this course, but I'm going to hit it again because it's really important. So osmolarity has to do with how much water is going to be pulled in a certain direction. So if water is being pulled out of your blood vessels and into your tissues, then you're going to get a puffy face or you're going to get swollen ankles. And so obviously that's not healthy. That's not a good thing. That's not what we want to have happen. So we don't want the osmolarity to be so off that it actually pulls the water out of our blood vessels. On the other hand, we don't want too much in the blood vessels because it'll shoot your blood pressure up. So that's one of the regulatory functions that the blood helps. And then, of course, we have hormones that help, and we'll learn more about how we can control blood pressure soon. All right, we know that we have about 0.9% saline or salt, NaCl, in our body. We also have potassium chloride and some other chloride compounds. But we're about 0.9%. So if you go into the hospital and they start an IV, they're not going to be running water in you because that would mess up your osmolarity. So to maintain your osmolarity, they're going to run in 0.9% saline into your IV, unless you need nutrients, and then they'll give you dextrose or ringers or some other something in your IV. But almost everyone gets a saline IV. One of the things I want to emphasize right now, I tell all of my students this: you go to the doctor and they draw blood or they run some sort of a test, you have the right to get a copy of your test results. Now, a lot of times you'll go and say, hey, can I have a copy of my test results? And they may, try to talk you out of it and say, oh, no, everything's fine. You don't need that. You don't need that. Because you're taking this class, I strongly urge you to get your test results and look at them. And occasionally you'll see that they misread your results. That's happened to me a number of times, but of course I'm old, so about everything in the world's happened to me in my lifetime. But look and see what your test results are. You have the right. And some of the places now are putting your results online, so you can actually look them up. So they've stopped fighting with you, because I don't think they want to go look it up and make a copy for you and do all that stuff. So I think that's one of the reasons they just say, no, you don't really need your test results. And then, of course, there's some people who get their test results and freak out. And then they go Google everything, and then they think they're dying. So anyway, but I recommend that you guys get your results. And it will tell you what is normal. All right. The hematocrit, when you spin it down, a woman should be anywhere from 37 to 48%. If you're over that, that's way too much. And your blood is going to be too thick, and it's going to be causing problems in your body. Men should be between 45 and 52%. So they may actually be more than half plasma, half red blood cells. So the amount of hemoglobin that is inside of the red blood cells is also measured, and a woman should have between 12 and 16 grams per deciliter, and men should have 13 to 18 grams per deciliter. So they're going to have more red blood cells, and they're going to have more hemoglobin, which kind of makes sense since the red blood cells carry the hemoglobin. And the platelet count, this tells you how many platelets you have. So whether or not you're going to be able to clot, this is a good thing. And one of the things we're seeing with COVID is some people have abnormal clotting. So if you have a ferritin level, and that's not on this list right here, but they can do, when they draw blood, they can look at your ferritin level. And ferritin has to do with the iron in your body, and the iron is associated with your hemoglobin, and they can see whether you're likely to have a stroke or blood clot. So if you go into the hospital and you're having your blood drawn for COVID, have them check your ferritin levels and make sure that you're not going to have blood clots, because they can easily stop that if they realize that you have elevated ferritin levels. here's another lookup table where you don't have to memorize all of this stuff, but you should know that your blood, the part that's not the red blood cells or the white blood cells, not the formed elements, but the part that's in the plasma, it is mostly just water. It's 92% water. And then you have up from 6 to 9 grams per deciliter of proteins. The most abundant protein that you have in your blood is albumin. And if you've ever cracked an egg, you know that there's the egg white and then there's the egg yolk. That egg white is albumin. So you have that running around in your bloodstream. So I always thought it was funny when there was a movement afoot that says, oh my goodness, don't eat eggs. Whatever you do, don't eat eggs because they're so unhealthy for you. And I'm like, hey, they got albumin. We need albumin. Not unhealthy. So anyway, now it's back to, hey, it's okay to eat eggs again. So we go through weird fads. Somebody gets an idea in their head and they publish it and everybody goes, yeah. So if something sounds goofy to you, go research it. That was a goofy one. All right. Globulins. We'll talk a little bit more about globulins in a minute because we have 3 kinds and they all do something a little bit different. And then fibrinogen. So fibrin is what causes your blood to clot. So I need to have that fiber, that fibrin ready so that when I need to clot, it's there and ready to go. I don't have to stop and go make some. So, but I don't want my blood clotting. So to make it, I make fibrinogen. So I add something on it that makes it inactive. I make it too big. And then when I need it, all I have to do is just whack a piece off and then there you go. It's kind of like Band-Aids. If you don't have any Band-Aids in the house, you got to drive to the store and get Band-Aids and drive home, open the box, take the Band-Aid out, and take the little protective cover off. But if you cut yourself and you have a box of Band-Aids handy, you just open it up, take a Band-Aid out, take the little protective cover off of it and slap it onto your cut, and there you go. So fibrinogen is an inactive form of fibrin. So it's made, it's ready to go, but you just haven't pulled the piece off of it that's going to make it sticky so that it causes your blood to clot. So that's kind of a cool thing. So these are the main 3 proteins, 3 classes of proteins that you have in your plasma. And then nutrients, things that you have running around in your plasma is sugar, of course. Now, in America, we call it glucose, but everywhere else in the world, they call it dextrose. So this is the same thing, glucose, dextrose. For some reason, we just do that. Another thing that we call different than the rest of the world is adrenaline. So in America, everybody knows about adrenaline. So, whoa, man, I had an adrenaline rush. And if you say that in another country, they just may look at you and go, huh? And you go, I had an epinephrine rush. And they're like, oh, wow, okay. So everyone else calls it epinephrine, but we call it adrenaline. So it's one of the hormones we'll be talking about. You probably heard of people who have EpiPens. They have literally a syringe full of adrenaline. So that if a couple of people who've gotten the vaccine have had an allergic reaction to something in the vaccine. And so they have to have a shot of epinephrine or adrenaline to stop the allergic reaction that's caused by the vaccine. So it's a rare side effect, but it does happen from time to time. So they've got EpiPens standing by just in case. Let's see, other things, you have amino acids, and you need these because you build proteins with amino acids. You have lactic acid, you have fats, cholesterol, fatty acids, and everybody's like, oh my gosh, you shouldn't have cholesterol. Oh, cholesterol is terrible. Cholesterol is what makes up part of your cell membrane. And it's what makes up the whole class of steroid hormones. So if you don't have cholesterol, you don't have estrogen, you don't have testosterone, you don't have any of the other steroid hormones. So cholesterol is a wonderful thing to have in your body, and it is necessary, but you want it to be in this range right there. You don't want it to be way over here, because the theory is if you have too much cholesterol, it'll clog your arteries. It'll literally just stick and make a big greasy mess on your arteries, and then you can't get the blood to go through. So, but you definitely need cholesterol. You definitely don't want to cut cholesterol out of your diet. And then you have fatty acids, and you have high density lipoproteins and low density lipoproteins. And the theory is the high density, meaning big, lipids, will stick all these low density lipoproteins, because fat likes to stick with fat. It coagulates. If you've ever made a pot roast and then you put it in the refrigerator and you take it back out, you see this big layer of coagulated grease or fat on the top of it. So that's what's going on here. If you got really big wads of fat and you've got little bitty bits of fat, they'll stick to the big wads. So the more high density lipoprotein you have, the happier they are, because it'll mop up all of these low density lipoproteins. And they do a ratio. So they talk about your ratio right there. And your triglycerides. Hopefully you learned last semester that a triglyceride is a half of a sugar molecule with 3 fats hanging off of it. So if you eat a donut, man, there's the sugar, there's the fat, and your triglycerides will go up like crazy. I know this for a fact because I absentmindedly ate a couple of donuts before I went in and had my blood tested, and it was supposed to be a fasting blood test, meaning I had not eaten any sugar, I had not eaten any fats, and they just wanted to know what the minimum level was in my body. Well, my triglycerides were over 1,000, and they're supposed to be between 40 and 150. And the lady said, "Oh my gosh, is this fasting?" And I said, "No, man, I just ate some donuts." She goes, "Oh, thank God, I thought you were dying." So anyway, if you have a fasting blood drawn, don't eat donuts before you go in and have it done, because you'll freak out the person who draws your blood. Phospholipids, this is what we make our cell membranes out of. And of course you've got to have iron, because iron is what is the oxygen capturing molecule inside your hemoglobin. Other things that you have in your plasma include vitamins and sodium, calcium, potassium, magnesium, chlorine, bicarbonate, phosphate, sulfate, and then waste. And nitrogen-containing waste, urea, uric acid, creatine, ammonia, and bilirubin. These are breakdown products. And if these nitrogen-containing wastes get too high in your bloodstream, if you make them faster than your kidney can filter them out, you will die. In fact, most people who die do so because of a buildup of nitrogenous waste, unless, of course, you got hit by a car or something like that. So most people, when they say they died of cancer, they actually died because they no longer could clean the nitrogenous waste out of their blood, and so on like that. So, but since almost everyone dies of that, they don't put that on your death certificate. They put down your major cause. You died because you had cancer. I'm spending a lot of time going over the various components, not because I expect you to memorize them, but because when you get your test results back, I want you to say, "Oh, I remember Miss Drake talking about that. Okay, so what does it mean that I have elevated ammonia in my bloodstream? Okay, so I need to think about why that's occurring, and is that natural? Well, did I do something recently, like me eating donuts and elevating my triglycerides. When they redid my triglycerides fasting, I was just fine. And I don't need medicine, and I'm not in imminent danger of dying. But it's important to follow up, because if my triglyceride level really was up in the 1,000 range, then I would be in trouble if that was a fasting level. So I'm spending a little more time than probably you might think that I need to make sure that you guys understand what's going on there, but not to sit and memorize it, because they'll give you, this is the value we expect, and this is what value you got. So other things that are in the blood, of course, you've got carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, and enzymes. You have various enzymes in there, and you have various hormones. So they would run a special test. They would draw a special tube of blood to look for hormones or to look for active enzymes. Alrighty, and now we get down into the three things that I told you we were going to talk about. Albumin, it causes the viscosity. So just like if you've ever felt the white of an egg, you know how viscous it is. Your plasma should feel about the same viscosity. And one of the things that your body does is it has white blood cells that run around and eat things that it feels should not be there. Well, sometimes you take medicine and the white blood cells in the liver think, hey, that's not supposed to be there, and so it destroys the medicine. And so sometimes, hey, I want the medicine to be there. So you can design drugs that can be injected into the body or can be taken and absorbed out of the intestines, and they will go and stick onto the albumin and kind of hide. So the albumin can take these drugs and transport them throughout your body, and then when it gets to where you need it, it comes off of the albumin and it escaped your system that tears down foreign invaders. So albumin helps transport various things like medicines and so on. Hormones, calcium, carries it around. And then globulins, here's the breakdown of the three kinds of globulins that you kind of need to know. So I will tell you that. You need to know about albumin, and you need to know the three kinds of globulins. So especially you need to know gamma globulins, because that's the one that's super important. In fact, we'll have a whole chapter on that in a couple of weeks. So the alpha globulins, they help you with the prothrombin, help you blood clot. They transport copper. They transport hemoglobin. So the dead erythrocyte breaks open and all the hemoglobin that's inside is released into your bloodstream, and these globulins will pick it up and carry it and recycle it, and then you can make more red blood cells. And it also helps you transport fat-soluble vitamins and hormones. So alpha globulins are kind of cool for transporting things and helping your blood to clot. And then the beta globulins transport iron for you. And they help you destroy toxic things that get in your body. So one of the things that bacteria do when they get in your body, they divide. So that's obviously they're using up your food, and they give off waste. So they're giving, they're creating toxic mess that you have to get rid of. But one of the things that bacteria have figured out how to do is to actually make toxins. So an example of this is, you probably heard, don't ever give honey to babies, because they were feeding babies honey thinking, well, this is natural and it's healthy and all this, and some of the babies got sick and died. And when they looked at honey, there's botulism toxin in honey. Now, you and I, it's such a low level of botulism toxin that it doesn't hurt us. But babies, if you think about how tiny they are, and they're not really adept at breaking down toxic substances yet. So they haven't learned how to do that. So if you give a baby honey and there's enough botulism toxin in it, it can kill the baby. So that's one of the reasons they tell you not to do that. So there's not the active bacteria in there. It's just some toxin that's left over from bacteria. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there because you guys are of childbearing age, most of you, and it's important to know that you shouldn't give babies honey and why. All right, and again, transport lipids. So there you go. This transports lipids, this transports lipids, and this transports lipids. So it's really important to move that lipid around and not let it stick onto the walls of your arteries and your blood vessels. Now, gamma globulins are what we call antibodies. And like I said, we have a whole chapter just on that we'll be talking about it. So antibodies, if you have enough antibodies, they will surround foreign invaders and keep them from further infection. So they can surround bacteria, they can surround COVID virus, pneumonia virus, worms, if they're small enough, and fungus. So antibodies are really awesome, and they're specific. So in your body right now, if I took blood out of any one of you guys, I would probably find antibodies for measles, because you all had measles shots. I would find it against tetanus, because you had a DPT shot. I would find antibodies against diphtheria. And for those of you who have already had your COVID vaccine, I would find antibodies against COVID. So antibodies are cool, and they circulate around in your blood, and if they find that foreign invader, that specific one that they're made for, they will stop it, and then you don't have to worry about getting sick because the antibody will surround it, and then the white blood cells will come and destroy it. So that's the object of immunizations. Fibrinogen, I talked about, becomes fibrin and allows blood to clot. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. As you're reading your chapter, look at things like this. The liver produces 4 grams of plasma protein per hour, and it contributes all the major proteins except for the gamma globulin. Remember, the gamma globulin are the antibodies, so that's a whole nother thing. So what would happen if you had liver cancer and your liver stopped working because the cancer was destroying the liver tissue? Or if you have hepatitis, which attacks the liver. So periodically, as you're reading, they'll ask you questions. Stop. Just stop and think. Hey, what would happen here? And you go back and you go, well, you would be making plasma protein. So you wouldn't be able to transport lipids. You wouldn't be able to transport ions or copper. So all the things that are transported and done by the proteins. Also, you're not going to have the correct viscosity of your blood because you're not making enough albumin. So all of those things can occur. And then, of course, if you can't make fibrinogen, then you're not going to be able to clot your blood. So just stop and think about stuff every now and then. I'm going over this very carefully with you in the beginning because I want to help you see how to read the book and see what's important and what's just a lookup table. But we'll speed up a little bit as we go on because the chapters are like 30 pages long. And you guys don't want to listen to me for that many hours if I read the book and explain every little bit to you. They're talking about viscosity, and if you don't have enough red blood cells, then your blood will flow too easily. If you have too many red blood cells, your blood flows too sluggishly. So it's so thick and sludgy that it has problems running through your blood system or your cardiovascular system. And that'll put a strain on your heart and can cause cardiovascular problems. Now, one of the things that athletes do is blood doping. So they'll actually have an IV of their own blood, and they'll use that before a game. So they'll have more red blood cells, so they can carry more oxygen, they'll have more stamina, and they can keep going longer. But they also run the risk of a heart attack or a stroke because they have too many red blood cells. So you do have to kind of think about common sense things. If you've forgotten osmosis, look at this. They have a little thing right here, and you can play a video that'll explain osmosis to you. But if you can remember this, wherever there's more protein, wherever there's more stuff, the water is going to go that way. If you've got more electrolytes, if you've got more proteins, the water will go in that direction to try and dilute it. That's the whole basis of osmosis. So we call the area where there's more electrolytes or where there's more proteins, we call that hypertonic. That region is hypertonic. And water will flow in that direction to dilute it. If you have an area where there's not very much stuff, for example, if somebody accidentally started an IV of pure water, now inside your bloodstream, you would have all of your proteins diluted out, so you don't have as much. So what's going to happen is the water is going to run out and into your tissues, because there's not as much stuff in your blood vessels. Your blood has become hypotonic, and the water will leave that area and go into the hypertonic area, which is outside the blood vessels. On the other hand, those guys who did the blood doping, and they gave themselves an IV of their own red blood cells so that they would have a higher hematocrit, so they can carry more oxygen. Now they have more stuff in their blood cells. And what's going to happen is fluid is going to be pulled into the bloodstream, pulled into the blood vessels to try and dilute that out. And these people are going to have high blood pressure because the vessels can only hold so much. And if you try to put more than that in there, they'll swell up and you can have an aneurysm. So not a good thing to do. So understand osmosis. Wherever there's more stuff is hypertonic. Wherever there's not as much stuff is hypotonic. And water will always go in the hypertonic direction. I'm going to tell a story on myself. It's one I'm not proud of, but I don't want you to be as arrogant and ignorant as I was when I was young. We used to have little fundraisers at our school, and they put up posters of kids that kind of look like this. And they'd say, can you give up your milk money? Can you give up some of your lunch money to help these starving children? And I never had any money. My parents never gave me an allowance. I never had any money. I had barely enough to buy my lunch, and that was it. And so I said, well, obviously that child is not starving, because look at that belly. You know, you don't get fat like that unless you have plenty to eat. Well, I had no idea. But what's going on in this child is something called ascites. And this child has so little protein in its body that it can't hold the fluid in its vessels. It can't hold the fluid in its stomach. It's actually digesting its own proteins. Because if your body needs proteins and you're not eating any, you will actually just start eating yourself. You'll digest your own muscles. You'll digest your own heart. A lot of people who have anorexia, they don't eat, they end up having a heart attack because they've weakened the heart so much. So what has happened here is the fluid there's nothing to hold it into the blood vessels. There's nothing to hold it into the stomach. And so it actually just fills up the abdomen. So this is a bag of fluid in a starving child. The name for this particular condition is kwashiorkor. Kwashiorkor. And it's where they have ascites so badly. Ascites so badly that they look like this. But you can see those little bitty arms and legs. There's no meat on them. There's no muscle. They've digested all of that away. Here are some big numbers. Every day an adult produces about 400 billion platelets, about 200 billion red blood cells, and about 10 billion white blood cells. So you're constantly replacing the ones that die. But did you know that you were making billions just of those cells in your body? The name of the process where you're making red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets is hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis. Of course, we remember hemato. Anytime you see that, it means blood. Hemato, blood. And the poiesis is the formation of. So we're going to see the word poiesis a few more times. But that happens to be the formation of blood. And if you understand hematopoiesis, then you'll understand things like leukemia, anemia, and other blood disorders. So basically, they're talking about other things besides humans, but we also have something that is kind of like a yolk sac. It, like a chicken, can completely form inside of an egg. There's enough nutrients, there's enough of everything inside the albumin, the white of the egg, and the yolk of the egg to make an entire chicken and all the bits and pieces of it. So we start out having food available to us, but then once we have our umbilical cord, now we can tap into mom and we can steal her food. So we don't have to just rely on a yolk sac the way some things like fish, amphibians, and so on do. All right. If you ask somebody, hey, where do you make red blood cells? Where do you make white blood cells? They'll go, oh, you make it in your bone marrow. You're like, yep, you do. But you also make it other places. So before you're born, your liver is making blood cells. Your spleen is making blood cells. After you're born, your spleen keeps on making lymphocytes, and if it needs to, it can kick in and make red blood cells also. But the bone marrow, the red bone marrow, produces all of the formed elements. And lymphocytes, those are the white blood cells, are also produced in lymphatic tissues and in your thymus, your tonsils, lymph nodes, spleen, and your mucous membranes. So that's kind of interesting that the white blood cells are made multiple places, but it tells you how important that they are. So you have backup places and other backup places that can keep making white blood cells for you. So blood formation in the bone marrow and the lymphatic organs is myeloid, if it's made in the bone marrow, myeloid in the bone marrow, and lymphatic organs make lymphoid hematopoiesis. All right, you got that? Myeloid in the marrow, lymphoid in the lymphatic organs. Should be pretty easy. Now we're going to talk about stem cells for a second. If you have a stem cell that can become anything, then we call it a totipotent. Completely potent. It can become a nerve cell, a fat cell, bone cell, anything in the whole body. So when people talk about stem cells, they're almost always talking about the totipotent kind. But we're going to talk about a multipotent or pluripotent, meaning it can do various things, but in the case of the hematopoietic stem cell, it's committed to doing something to do with blood. So it hasn't made up its mind completely whether it's going to be a red blood cell or a white blood cell or a platelet, but it knows it's going to be one of the formed elements of blood. So they're called multipotent or pluripotent. So I always call them pluripotent. So this is the first book that I've seen that calls them multipotent. But as they say, stem cell biology is a new and exciting science out there, and so different people call them different things. So you have these things, and they will decide whether to become red blood cells, white blood cells, or platelets, depending on the need. So that's where your hormones come in. They say, hey, we need more red blood cells. Make more red blood cells. So the stem cells that were undecided are now decided, and they make red blood cells. But the thing is, if you're busy making red blood cells, you don't make as many white blood cells, because you can't be all things. You have to decide which one you're going to be. So if you're off making white blood cells, you're not making as many, red blood cells, you're not making as many white blood cells. Now, if you have an infection and your white blood cell count goes up, then that's because you're telling your pluripotent or multipotent stem cells, hey, I need white blood cells. Make me some white blood cells. And it's like, okay. So then you don't make as many red blood cells. And if you need blood clotting, then you're going to be making more of the megakaryocytes. You're going to be making more platelets. So one of the things that is kind of a tragic thing about, say, leukemia, is the message goes, hey, I need some white blood cells. Because you have cancer, because you have a kind of leukemia, you don't make functioning white blood cells. So the message just keeps on going, hey, I said I needed some white blood cells. And so you're trying to make white blood cells, but you're not making competent white blood cells. You're not making functioning white blood cells. So because you keep on and on and on trying to make white blood cells, you stop making enough red blood cells and you become anemic. So a lot of times the first indication a person has that they have leukemia is that they're anemic. And they go in and they have their blood drawn and they see, whoa, you have way too many white blood cells, way too many white blood cells, and not nearly enough red blood cells. And so then they know you have leukemia. Now, the odd thing is, a lot of people die of leukemia from diseases because they don't have competent white blood cells to fight off diseases. So they keep making white blood cells, but they don't work right. So they can't fight off things. So you're going to have to go in and actually kill off the pluripotent stem cells, the defective cells, and give the person bone marrow from someone else that knows how to make white blood cells. So, anyway, hopefully that helps you understand pluripotent cells and hematopoiesis. At the end of each section, it gives you some things. Try and see if you can answer these questions. What are 2 transport functions that the blood does? What are 2 protective functions? And what are 2 regulatory functions? And if you forget, scroll back up and find the answers before you move on. What are the 2 principal components of blood? Well, you've got the liquid part and you've got the formed elements, like the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. What are the 3 major classes of plasma proteins? Oh, there was that albumin stuff, and then there was those globulins. What was that other one? Had something to do with clotting. So go look it up. Hematopoiesis. Why is it important? Can you explain hematopoiesis in leukemia? Can you explain hematopoiesis in anemia? So I'm going to stop here, and we'll take up in the next lecture with the next page.